But Mark is very to the point here. Mark says one of the servants, and he doesn't name him because it doesn't matter to him. In the course of his description, it matters not who pulled out the sword and struck. What matters is that Jesus in verse 48 says to them, wait a second, are you coming out against me like a robber with swords and clubs to take me? I was daily with you in the temple, teaching. You did not seize me. He points out something here that I think is very interesting. The religious leaders feel that they are losing their influence over the people, and their religion is suffering, and therefore their power is suffering, so that is why they're going after Jesus. But they come to Jesus not openly, but in a cowardly fashion, unwilling to challenge him openly, for fear that he has more influence with the people than they do. In verse 49, Jesus points out their cowardice when he says, I was daily with you in the temple teaching, and you didn't seize me. You can just hear that in his voice. You can see that in the scene, that Jesus is saying, why are you coming out against me like a robber? I was in the temple. You could have walked up at any time and grabbed hold of me. And it's as if in a backhanded way Jesus is saying, you are doing this, and you're doing it in a cowardly fashion. He is not a robber. Now, this word for robber is specific. Don't confuse it with the same idea of thief. A thief is somebody who takes something by stealth. But a robber is someone who uses violence to take something away from someone. Jesus uses this term for the violent attackers in the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke 10. Jesus used this same term. This robber, this highwayman, sets upon this guy. So this guy is traveling, and robbers jump out of the ditch, and they take his stuff by force. They beat him and leave him for dead. This same word is used of Barabbas. This same word is used of the two that are crucified on each side of Jesus. And in that scene at the cross where he's got a robber on his left and a robber on his right, and the one in the middle is not. You see the irony of the accusation here. Jesus says, you come out against me like I'm taking something by violence. I'm not a robber. They don't know who they're grabbing a hold of. They don't understand what's going on. They have no idea the magnitude of what they're involved in right now. When I was younger, I went to my first real, what I consider to be a science class in the 9th grade. And I had a wonderful teacher, a wonderful science teacher that showed us how the world worked together. And he would show us about the cell, and he would show us about how an animal's joint worked, and he would show us about how our own bodies worked, how everything works together. And then I remember one day he taught us about how a blade of grass works, probably the most common thing that we see every day, a blade of grass, one solitary blade of grass. How there's a transport system, how everything comes from the bottom to the top. And I remember distinctly after being in that class, in the evening time, I was laying out in the yard, and it was just a great evening to be outside. And I went and laid down in the grass, and I began to look at that one blade of grass in front of me. And I thought about how it brought the water from the ground up in there, how when the sun hit it, it was able to convert the energy into photosynthesis, how it fed itself and took in carbon dioxide, gave off oxygen, and I was just amazed that in my hand, in front of me, right where I was something of immense value. Something fashioned with the hands of God, made by Him to perform a function, and so precious, though it was seemingly so common. And as they grab a hold of the Lord of glory, as these men walk up to Him and grab His arms, they have no idea who they're grabbing a hold of. They have no idea of the immense worth of Christ. They don't know how precious He is. To them, He is just common, and the Bible says that He has nothing about Him that would draw us to Him. You're not going to look at Him and say, wow, that's the guy I need to be with. But when you hear what He says, when you realize who He is, you'll be drawn toward Him. And as they grab this guy, they have salvation in their hands. They have God inhabiting flesh. Someone grabs the bicep of the Lord of all the universe. Somebody else grabs the shoulder of the King of glory. And they have no idea. No idea. As they arrest him, they have no idea about who they're grabbing a hold of. How much more value does Christ have than anything else we might have in our lives? No matter how complex, no matter how helpful. You know, as I laid in that yard and I looked at that blade of grass, what I thought was, wow, this is amazing. God has created this. This is precious. And it made me understand other things, and it made me appreciate other things. But until I came to know Christ, I never realized just how much value could be present in one person, Jesus. Is that not why we do what we do? Is that not why we go and tell people? Is that not why we witness to people and minister to people? Because we want them to know the reason I do this is not because of me, but because of someone who is of immense and uncalculable value. Someone you should meet. Jesus is precious. And we don't need to miss out on one thing that Jesus has for us. Following Christ is never going to be about loss. It's always going to be about gain. And if you don't see it that way, you see it wrongly. If you believe you have to give something up to follow Jesus, you don't understand what Jesus wants to do. What you're going to give up to follow Him in your mind is going to seem like garbage compared to what Jesus is going to give you. The relationships you have to let go of are going to seem like trifles compared to what Jesus wants to give you. If you gave up everything you own and sold what you have and went and lived in a mud hut in the middle of nowhere, if you had Jesus, you'd be the richest person on earth. Because everything that's good, everything that's holy, everything that's precious, everything that's desirable was formed and fashioned by God in the God-man. As a man, He lived for you, He lived for me, but He wants to give Himself to you. Now, the last thing we see here is this. First, He was betrayed by His disciple. Then He was arrested by His enemies. And lastly, and what I think most tragically, He was deserted by all of His followers. So we see that Judas said, I'm going to hand over Jesus to you. We see that those temple guards in the crowd said, well, we're going to grab hold of Jesus then. And we see the disciples say, well, let's just let go of Jesus. This is very sad. Verse 50 through 52. Then they all forsook Him and fled. All who? The other 11 who were there. Judas had already forsook Him. He'd already betrayed Him. But the other 11 that were there with Him, they all forsook Him and fled. Verse 51. Now, we have this kind of inserted narrative here. Now, a certain young man followed Him, having a linen cloth thrown around his naked body. And the young men laid hold of him. He probably lives in a house somewhere in Jerusalem. He heard the crowd going, and they were talking about, hey, we're going to go get this Jesus. There's this guy that's been preaching, and we're going to go find him. Maybe he heard that, and he threw some clothes on and went. Maybe he was just attracted by the crowd. Maybe he is what a lot of people say is he is a young John Mark. But we don't know. There's not enough in the text to know. All we know is there's a certain young man, and he is so afraid of being grabbed and associated and arrested and punished with Jesus that he's willing to run away naked. They reach out to grab him, and all they grab is the cloth as he turns to run. And then you see this young man naked running out of the garden because he violently wants to be separated from Jesus. He does not want to be associated with Him. This word that's translated as forsake has the root in the idea of letting go of something. You let it go. You just drop it. That's what it means. You pull something out, you hold it, you drop it. That's the idea of this word of being forsaken. The word was used when the disciples left their nets. Do you remember that? When Jesus walked up and says, come with me, I'll make you fisher of men. And it says they left their nets. It's the same word. It was used when James and John left their father. Jesus said, come on, let's go. I'll make you fishers